may be a friendly takeover. It may not be a friendly takeover. It wouldn't matter because they're down to, as they say, fumes. They have no energy. They have no money. They're in deep trouble on a humanitarian basis.
And joining us now to unpack President Trump's latest comments on Latin America is John Suarez, Executive Director at the Center for a Free Cuba. John, thank you so much for joining us. Great to have you. Now, President Trump saying negotiations are active and a deal could happen very easily. Here's actually the president over the weekend speaking on that.
Cuba is in its last moments of life, as it was. It'll have a great new life, but it's in its last moments of life the way it is. And but our focus right now is on Iran, and we'll do that.
What would the deal need to bring real change to Cuba?
Well, I think looking at what the administration has put out, there are two documents, a national strategic document that they put out in December and a presidential executive order in January, which pointed to the Cuban government as an unusual and malign threat to the United States and the region. Now, the December national security document points to the U.S. Placing a new emphasis on Latin America and the Western Hemisphere, and also not having tolerance for regimes hostile to the United States, which really puts under a spotlight Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua. All three regimes have close relations with Moscow, Beijing, and Tehran. They all three have very strong anti-American statements and policies, and they've also been linked to terrorist groups like Hezbollah and Hamas. In the case of Cuba and Venezuela, of actually hosting them in bases in their respective countries. So I think for the president and for his national security interest, it would involve, one, Cuba withdrawing all the Cuban agents currently in Venezuela that have been torturing Venezuelans that were protecting Nicolas Maduro. 32 were killed when Maduro was extracted on January 3rd of 2026. And secondly, Cuba would have to shut down the Chinese spy bases currently pointed at the United States, or at least 4 that we know about. They've been doing that. The Chinese have had a presence there since 1992. And obviously, there are currently minimum 7,000 Cubans fighting for Mr. Putin in Ukraine. Cuba has also signed military agreements with Lukashenko, the Belarusian regime, which is also supporting the Russian war against Ukraine. So I think those would be a few of the elements that would have to change. And obviously, the administration has also been talking about the need for economic reform. So I think based on what the administration is saying, Cuba would have to stop being a base of operations for the enemies of the United States, open up its economy so that Cubans are able to thrive. The reason that Cuba today has to have 80% of its food imported, most of it from the United States, $810 million in trade last year of exports from the United States to Cuba, is due to the communist centralized planning of the regime. Cuba, prior to 1959, was able to feed itself, but since then it's been depending on outsiders to be able to sustain the population. And the administration has indicated that they want to see a change there. Now, the Cuban dissidents and the Cuban pro-democracy movement around the world obviously wants to see political change in Cuba and the restoration of democracy, because we believe that for there to be economic change in Cuba, that necessitates the rule of law. When the administration talks about a private sector, you really don't have a private sector in Cuba when you don't have an independent judiciary that can call balls and strikes over business deals. What you currently have is a judiciary controlled by the Castro family, which is a dictatorship, and you have an economy controlled by the Cuban military and a conglomerate called Gaesa. All that would have to be changed and opened up, and to do that, you need a democratic transition.
And digging into that, the president has said the operation in Iran is very complete, that they're far ahead of schedule. How soon could we see change come to Cuba?
I don't know. That's on the president's timetable. And, I'm with an NGO based in D.C. We're observers. We look at the policy implications, the policy papers put out by the administration. That gives us an idea of the direction they want to go in. But as in terms of the timing of when that would be executed, I don't have a real idea about that. But what I do know is this: Cuban Democrats inside and outside of the island are looking at the opportunity, as their Venezuelan counterparts are, to be able to push for change if the Trump administration is pressuring the regime to reform, to open up. Democrats have to find the way to fill up those spaces and push for democratic elections. Now, one difference between Venezuela and Cuba is that 30 years ago, this past month, February 24th of 1996, Cuban MiG shot down 2 American planes over international airspace. They were part of Brothers to the Rescue, a humanitarian organization that saved over 4,000 lives of Cuban rafters back then in the early 90s. Now, because of that attack, that act of state terrorism carried out by the Cuban dictatorship, the United States president at the time, Bill Clinton, signed the Helms-Burton Act, which codified sanctions into U.S. law. And for those sanctions to be lifted to normalize relations between Cuba on the economic front necessitates 3 conditions. 1, freedom of all political prisoners. There are currently over 1,200 political prisoners in Cuba. 2, legalizing political parties and independent press, opening up to basic civil and political liberties for the Cuban people. And 3rd, free and fair democratic elections. Those are the 3 conditions for lifting economic sanctions on the Cuban regime. And that's U.S. law.
And John, more broadly, through the Shield of the Americas coalition, President Trump is aiming to dismantle cartels and prevent foreign countries from gaining influence in the region. Here's actually part of that speech.
These brutal criminal organizations pose an unacceptable threat to national security, and they provide a dangerous gateway for foreign adversaries in our region. And we don't want them near our country either. We don't want them to come in. They're cancer, They're cancer, and we don't want it spreading.
And as we've reported extensively, China props up cartels by supplying fentanyl precursors. How much is the Chinese Communist Party to blame for the problems plaguing the Americas?
They have a lot of blame, but not solely them. We go back to 1961. It was the KGB that tasked the Czech intelligence service with working with Raul Castro. And there was a high-ranking Czech official who defected in 1968 that met with him several times a year between 1961 and 68. And back then, they were working to improve the capacity of drug trafficking networks in the Americas to flood the United States with drugs as what they viewed the soft underbelly to harm the United States and to compromise U.S. democracy. And the Cubans, even after the collapse of the Soviet Union in the 60s and the 80s and the 90s, continued with drug trafficking networks. In the 1980s, Raul Castro was floated as being under possible indictment, but it was quashed during the Clinton administration. They wanted to normalize relations. But with the arrival of Hugo Chavez, the Cubans played a role in the creation of the Solis cartel in Venezuela, which has pumped tons of cocaine into the United States and also into Europe. So Cuba has played a very negative role when it comes to drug trafficking in this hemisphere, and its tentacles have reached not only the United States, but also Europe and Canada in terms of killing young people in all those countries.
And the president emphasized 2 members of this new coalition that the U.S. could strike cartel members with missiles. All members have to do is ask. Is this changing the way the U.S. and its allies target cartels?
In the past, they were using primarily the U.S. Coast Guard, identifying drug boats, drug planes, and intervening and stopping them. Now they're apparently using military action, and that's definitely a change in tactics. With the older system, you had individuals to interview and to be able to extract more information. It appears that will not be as readily available with the current approach.